we haven't missed anything important. I was just on the slide talking about our organization and what we do, and hopefully everybody's back on track and you'll be able to hear me. So let's not waste any time and just move on with the presentation here. All right, all this wonderful research wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our core funders and other funders that you see here on your slide. So thank you so much. And I want to give a special shout out to Floor Canada for sponsoring CERI's webinars and breakfast overviews that we used to have when we did the in-person events. But anyway, so the presentation this morning will cover our mostly recently published 4-part series report that looks at the recovery pathways for Canadian energy sector as a result of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The way that the outline for this morning presentation will work is it will follow very closely to how the reports at various parts are presented on our website and in our reporting. One thing I do have to let you know is that parts 1 through 3 have been published and are available currently on our website. Part 4 is hasn't been published yet. It's in its final stages of preparation, but I'm happy to let you know that we do have the preliminary results that we will be sharing with you this morning. And then I will wrap up the presentation with some of the concluding remarks. Basically, the objective of this particular research was, first of all, to understand the adverse impacts that the pandemic has had on the Canadian energy sector. And the way we broke up the Canadian energy sector is we looked at the Canadian oil and gas industry, Canadian renewable energy, and then the Canadian electricity markets. We then wanted to understand what are the different government measures and stimulus packages that are available to various energy sectors that could potentially alleviate some of the negative adverse impacts that the pandemic has had on the sector. And then we wanted to analyze, what are those, in terms of the monetary value, what are the economic impacts of these various measures will have on the sector, and identify some of the opportunities going forward. So the pandemic, as we all know, has caused more disruption to the energy sector than any other event in recent history. The impacts of this pandemic will be felt for years to come. The International Energy Agency is suggesting that the energy demand contraction in 2020 was 7 times higher than was what was witnessed in the energy demand contraction during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So looking just briefly at what has been happening, at the time of publication of part 1, which was late summer, we were looking at rising COVID cases across all provinces in Canada. At that time, at the end of August, Quebec had the highest rate at 700 cases per 100,000 residents of that province. Alberta and Ontario was following closely, just shy of 300 cases. To give you an update, what has been happening since then, and since we published the report, we updated some of the analytics here, as you can see. We are officially, and it has been declared across some other countries around the world, that we are in a second wave of the pandemic. And since the summer months since some of the lockdown measures have been lifted, we are seeing, and with the influx of the cold weather, and we're staying indoors more, and the schools are open into in-person classes, we're starting to see the cases rising again. In fact, most recently, the rise in the cases represents more than 50% increase since last time we took the measurements. As you see here, Quebec is leading in a number of cases per 100,000 residents, followed by all the rest of the provinces as well. So what has transpired in terms of the economic impact as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown measures and the closure of non-essential businesses is that we see a contraction in the overall economic growth as well. So as of June, as of the beginning of the summer of this year, the International Monetary Fund was projecting the Canadian real GDP could fall by almost 8.5% in 2020. China was the only country that was forecasted to see some positive growth in the year 2020. However, since then, some of the lockdown measures have been lifted. So the businesses are now opening up, potentially at the reduced working hours. But however, it had a positive impact since the end of the second quarter of 2020. And what we're seeing is a revision of some of the numbers when it comes to the economic growth. So the International Monetary Fund is now is now expecting Canadian real GDP to improve by 1.3 percentage points. So now the overall contraction economy is being measured at about 7%. So, you're probably also aware what the impacts that have transpired in the Canadian economy. Canada has followed a similar path to other nations that have implemented certain measures in order to flatten the COVID case curve and not to have too much of a strain on our health facilities and hospitals and doctors and frontline workers and so on. So the governments, provincial, federal, municipal governments have urged people to practice physical distancing. We had stay-at-home measures. We were working from home. Restrictions on non-essential travel were implemented and still are maybe not enforced, but are encouraged. And we saw a widespread shutdown of non-essential businesses, which since then, like I said, have partially been lifted. All these different restriction measures have had a significant impact on the Canadian economy all across the board. We saw a decline in employment metrics. We saw a drop in international commodity trade, decline in capital investment into various projects. And as a result, our Canadian GDP has fallen in the second quarter of this year by 11.5%. Where the domestic demand for energy has sort of followed very closely and has fallen by 11%. So just quickly looking at the global energy markets, and just to set the context, Canada was not the only one that was negatively impacted. The containment measures in 187 countries around the world has brought the global economy to a halt. As we see, the most significant impact was felt in the month of April, where we saw oil demand contraction by almost 30 million barrels per day. The recovery in the second half of 2020 is projected to be gradual, and we're not expecting the oil demand to return to its pre-crisis level before the end of this year. In fact, the International Energy Agency, in their latest World Energy Outlook, has projected that energy demand, the overall energy demand, will be down by 5% in 2020, whereas oil demand will be down by 8%. Natural gas, it wasn't impacted as much as the oil demand was. However, we saw natural gas consumption decrease even prior to pandemic starting as a result of milder temperatures in Northern Hemisphere. In fact, we saw the gas demand reduced in Europe and similarly in the United States. However, when you look specifically at the statistics of United States and their natural gas demand, once we look at the temperature adjusted number, it's very insignificant change in comparison to 2019 consumption levels. The gas supply did not adjust to a drop in the consumption, which has resulted in a considerable buildup in the gas storage. In fact, for example, in the United States, inventories rose by 77% as compared with 2019 values, and it's also 17% above its 5-year average. In Europe, the inventories rose 40% to reach 80% above their 5-year average. So just before we go into the analysis of the various specific Canadian oil sectors, what we wanted to identify is to look at the various programs that were announced and implemented by the federal government and various provincial governments. And so through our analysis, we have at CERI identified 9 programs that you see here in front of you that would be applicable to the Canadian energy sector. We then use CERI's Canadian multi-regional input-output model to analyze the economic impacts of various government relief measures. And the dollar amount that you see here are the total dollar values that are available through these programs, but later on I will show you what we feel would be attributable to a specific sector out of these total amounts. Within the 9 programs, 8 of them are applicable to sectors in Canada outside of the energy sector, and the only one that is specifically applicable to oil and gas will be the last one that you see there, the grants that will be dealing with oil and gas well decommissioning. All right, so the next few slides, we will turn our attention specifically to the Canadian oil and gas sector. As I mentioned, COVID has had significant impact on energy-related activities in Canada and around the world. There was a sharp decline in energy demand and energy-related trade, which together with the initial price war between Saudi and Russia has triggered a significant drop in oil prices. Even prior to COVID-19 pandemic, market access and regulatory uncertainty and other global geopolitical events already been having a negative impact on employment rates across oil and gas producing jurisdictions in Canada. Since the pandemic, unemployment rates have increased even further, as you see on your chart here and in the table, across all the oil and gas producing provinces and you see here being represented by provinces of British Columbia, Newfoundland, Labrador, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The way we carried our analysis is we have looked at various sectors that make up the Canadian oil and gas sector, and that's the second column that you see there. We will be shocking the economic sectors that include oil and gas extraction, oil sands extraction, support activities, engineering, construction, petrochemicals, and the financial sector, or a portion of the financial sector that's attributable to oil and gas. And then the third column there represents the monetary values that we have assigned from the various government measures. And what we also are measuring, what is not shown here, is the short-term revenue forecast and the economic impacts that would result from the revenues captured by the oil and gas producers. All these different inputs go into our input-output model, and the output of the model are the economic impacts measured by microeconomic variables such as gross domestic product, tax revenues for various governments, labor income, and employment numbers. So this is the same table you saw earlier, except for we now have assigned specific dollar values from these different programs. The way we allocate the money was based on the sector's percentage share of their GDP contribution to the overall Canadian economy. As you see, most of these programs are short-term, specifically for the year 2020. The only multi-year program is the Orphan and Inactive Oil and Gas Well Grant. All right, the revenues were calculated based on our mostly recently produced forecast for the production of Canadian oil and gas resources. As well as we sourced the oil and gas prices from Sproul over the next 5 years, so 6-year period, 2020 to 2025. All right, so these are what you see here are the economic impacts analyzed of the government stimulus packages. The total GDP impact over the studied period would amount to about $8 billion Canadian, which will include direct and indirect impacts within producing regions of oil and gas, as well as indirect impacts within all the other provinces in Canada. The overall employment impact over 2020 to 2022 is estimated to be almost 42,500 full-time equivalent jobs. And labor income, which is not shown here but is available in the full report, labor income will amount to almost $4 billion, averaging for an annual salary of about $92,000 per person. The associated net tax revenues could be realized over this time period and amount to about $78 million. What you see here is the economic impacts of oil and gas revenues. We have estimated the economic impacts of the daily operations of this sector. We did not estimate the economic impacts of any new additional capital expenditures because it is so uncertain and we were not sure what those capital outlays would look like. So treat this estimate as a conservative estimate of the oil and gas sector activity. So what we're seeing here is a gradual growth of the GDP impact from the conventional crude oil and natural gas production. And the next slide will show you the economic impacts of oil sands revenues. And you see the overall GDP contribution of the oil sands sector is almost double that of the conventional and natural gas impacts. Here we wanted to look and identify, given all the stimulus packages and the forecasted revenues in year 2020, we wanted to compare these values to a historical baseline. So we looked at the annual average of 2015 to 2019 values of GDP contribution and full-time equivalent employment in provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador for the upstream E&P companies. And what we've done is compared the baseline to the stimulus packages economic impacts and the economic impacts that will stem from the forecasted revenues. And just to compare, we took a difference between the baseline and the total economic impacts. And as you can see, and that's the bottom row, the numbers that are in red, as you can see, that the economic stimulus packages and the revenues for 2020 are not capturing the historical baseline. We're still in short. The industry would still feel the adverse impacts of the pandemic, and the stimulus measures are not enough to capture the loss. The bottom table shows you the oil and gas service sector. What I forgot to mention when I showed you the employment chart is that the biggest impact on the oil and gas service sector was the loss of employment. And what we measure here is the baseline employment in the services sector, in the support activities for oil and gas, against what the lowest recorded numbers were, and then we identify what is that monetary outlay that would be required to bring back the oil and gas service sector employment to pre-crisis levels. Just before I move on to part three, I guess as a concluding thought to oil and gas is to understand that the economic stimulus measures were not a solution. It's a more of a short-term band-aid for the Canadian oil and gas industry. In the long term, the success of the industry would be highly dependent on the new capital investment coming into the sector. So let's switch gears and talk about the Canadian renewable energy. While the pandemic has reduced world energy demand, the effect on the renewable energy was less pronounced. However, operational impacts such as the site access restrictions or lack of available on-site staff could potentially lead to growth limitations and revenue deficits. On the financial side, maintaining agreed upon financial ratios and working capital could be a challenge. What has been identified in the literature is that the major economic impacts that could occur on the operating stage of the renewable energy projects would be the most felt for the projects that do not have the secured power purchase agreements. The financial impacts on projects that do have PPAs may not be as severely impacted. So again, these are the federal COVID-19 relief program measures that could potentially assist with the renewable energy sector. It was quite difficult for us to originally to identify, excuse me, what is the renewable energy sector in Canada, because there's no specific line in the industry tables that are presented by Statistics Canada. Regardless, though, we attribute these various programs to the renewable sector in proportion to our estimate of the GDP contribution, which is currently about 1.2% of the Canadian GDP that's contributed to renewable energy sector. We based these incentive programs that are available by 3 scenarios, and these are identified here on your slide, given the high level of uncertainty in terms of how the money would be delineated and spent by the renewable energy project operators. We find that the most pragmatic support for renewable energy comes in the form of the wage subsidy program. We also note that construction and financial challenges may benefit from the loan programs that are available, but the more substantive impact on new projects is the supply chain impacts and the construction delays what we found. When we compiled the information for the renewable energy sector, the federal and provincial governments have identified that the renewable energy sector could potentially access $544 million, which is somewhere in between our scenario 2 and 3. In contrast, however, the recent Canadian Task Force for Resilient Recovery recommends investing close to $11.5 billion over the next 5 years to grow the clean energy sector. So to estimate the potential contribution of the renewable energy sector, we went about looking at 3 potential case studies that could hypothetically would have an impact on the overall Canadian economy, and as well as sort of growing the renewable energy sector in these uncertain times of the pandemic. The 3 case studies that we analyzed are the utility scale wind power project, distributed solar PV project, and the bioethanol production facility. These case studies are intended to be illustrative and not exhaustive, and we're using the same methodological tool, our input-output model, to measure these estimates, to measure the economic impacts. Similar structure of how the results are calculated. And again, what we see here is for the typical utility scale wind project, for every $1 million invested, we're going to see about half a million GDP, it should say a million, GDP growth in overall Canadian GDP, and the $1 million investment would support about 4 or 5 jobs during the operation of this wind turbines. The typical utility scale wind project would amount to, in terms of the CapEx, about $1.9 million per megawatt. On a distributed solar project, again, we're seeing significant economic benefits as a result of a hypothetical distributed solar project. A typical distributed solar project would cost about $2.1 million per megawatt, and that number is decreasing as we're building more and more of these projects. On the bioethanol side here, for a facility with a production capacity of about 100 million liters of bioethanol per year, we're seeing for every $1 million invested, a significant 4 or 5 jobs are being sustained or created, and about $0.5 million of GDP as an economic impact, economic benefit to the Canadian economy. A typical bioethanol plant would be, for the CapEx numbers, would be around $1.1 million per every 1 million liters produced per year. All right, so switching gears here to the next part. Again, I just have to caution here, part 4 has not been published yet. We are in the last sort of stages of finalizing the report and formatting it, but I am happy to share some of the preliminary results that we were able to obtain. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the Canadian electricity sector, because it is not like, excuse me, other commodity markets, like, for example, crude oil and natural gas. There is no one specific Canadian electricity sector, and hence, when we looked at the impacts on the Canadian electricity sector as a result of the pandemic, we had to analyze the sector at the provincial levels. Regardless of the provincial market makeup, the electricity services are deemed essential for the economic and welfare of all citizens in Canada. As a result of that, unlike other commodities, electricity supply remains highly regulated across Canada. The goal of this regulation is to make sure that customers can receive a reliable and non-discriminatory access to electricity services, but at the same time that the electricity suppliers are able to maintain a long-term financial sustainability of their businesses. So since the pandemic, and just an overall sort of in theory discussion, what would happen if the electricity demand does decrease? Well, what that would generate is inadequate revenues to fund ongoing operations to meet the utility's short-term debt obligations. In the longer term, if the pandemic is sustained or there's unexpected changes that are prolonged, the earnings could be inadequate also to fund new capital expenditures and to attract future capital. These kind of deviations in the demand could also have sustainable public policy implications, as the current rates that utilities are charging to electricity services can no longer secure the financial sustainability of the sector. As a result of that, we could potentially, the utility companies that would see significant revenue losses, this could trigger the increase in electricity rates for all ratepayers. We deviated from our methodological framework for this particular investigation. Instead of using our input-output model, we used an econometric model looking at yearly fixed effects regression, where we control for the key variables of electricity demand to really isolate and estimate the decrease or the change in the total electricity demand due to COVID. And we analyzed this across 6 provinces of BC, Alberta, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI. We then, to break up the decrease in the total demand by customer classification, we analyzed the change in the number of active businesses within the various energy sectors, demand sectors, sorry, across industrial, commercial, and residential sectors. And then we used the existing or current electricity rates to estimate the revenue losses due to COVID. So what you see here is a change in electricity demand that is specifically attributable to COVID-19 pandemic. Unlike other presentations that you might have seen where you just see the change being measured in electricity demand, this is the result of the regression analysis that isolates the COVID-related impact. And as you can see here, maritime provinces fared fairly well, not really significant change in the overall electricity demand across residential, commercial, industrial sectors. However, we see a significant demand contraction in electricity across industrial and commercial users, specifically in the large province of Ontario, followed by Alberta and BC, and a significant uptick in the energy demand in the residential sector. Our findings are consistent with early findings reported by the Alberta Electric System Operator and the Independent Electricity System Operator in Ontario. So the demand measure, change in the demand, as you saw there on your graph, does translate to some of the revenue losses. Again, these are the preliminary results. What we're seeing here is significant losses in revenue for the most populous province in Canada, which is Ontario, followed by provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. The change in the revenues or the loss in revenues is calculated based on the variable portion of the electricity rate, which is the charge that's attributable to specifically based on the energy consumed, so your kilowatt hour voltage. And just to wrap it up before we go into our Q&A, so for specifically for oil and gas, as I already mentioned, that the relief measures are significant. They do bring in additional $8 billion of GDP contribution. However, they are not a long-term solution for a struggling sector, or even if it's not even a solution for various governments that rely on the sort of ripple effects throughout the economy as a result of the oil and gas development and activity of the sector. The long-term future of Canadian oil and gas would be highly dependent on the capital investment that the sector can capture. And this ability to attract capital is, in its turn, is also dependent on the higher market access to the markets where the Canadian producers are trying to reach, regulatory certainty, new technology development, the performance on the ESG framework. This is the environmental, social, and governance, and looking at potentially creating value-add product pathways that are looking beyond our traditional products that we create from these resources. When it comes to renewable energy, the effect of the pandemic on this sector was less pronounced than it was, for example, for oil and gas. Again, though, there are certain constraints when it comes to operating these projects and some constraints when it comes to the financial impact. As I mentioned, those projects that do have secured power purchase agreements may not be as severely impacted as those ones that are not secured. For the Canadian electricity markets, what we found is that in the provinces where the delivery charges are independent of the energy consumed, the revenue losses are almost entirely borne by the electricity generators. This also shields consumers from future electricity rate increases. In essence, this basically makes the utility companies almost are becoming immune to electricity demand variations. On the second point there, on the sort of long-term longevity of the electricity sector will definitely depend on the reestablishing the regular operations for the commercial and industrial sectors, specifically, for example, manufacturing sector. If these if the businesses continue operating on the reduced rates or keep shutting down, utilities not only lose variable revenues that we saw there in the first point, but they will also start to lose fixed revenues. Under these scenarios, all ratepayers will ultimately bear the cost down the road. So with that, I just want to conclude that the overall findings, excuse me, of our report do show significant adverse impacts of the COVID pandemic, specifically on oil and gas sector. When it comes to renewable energy, we're not seeing as a significant impact. However, if Canada is to fulfill its targets and its obligations under various international agreements, then the clean tech and renewable energy sector would have to see significant growth and significant capital injection to grow various projects. On the electricity side, because of how the electricity markets are set up in Canada and they're so regionalized, the COVID impacts will vary province to province, customer base to customer base, but the overall impact we saw was not as detrimental to the Canadian economy as potentially oil and gas sector would be. And just to wrap it up, I want to do some shameless promotion. We have an upcoming petrochemical conference that we have rescheduled that was canceled for this year. It is rescheduled back in June in Kananaskis for year 2021. But before June, between now and June, stay tuned for more announcement coming on our website for additional webinars that will be coming. In November and December, we'll be taking a month off, but then starting back up in January again. So with that, thank you very much. I'm hoping I'm gonna switch over to my questions panel over here. Okay, so here I have one question here, but please feel free to start typing in your questions. And the question is related to the wind farm. Let's see, let me just pull my numbers here. So the question is a renewable analysis saying that a 100 megawatt wind farm would support 500 to 700 jobs a year? So the metric that you saw there on your screen, that was more of a, I guess, intensity measure. So what we were saying is for every $1 million invested on the operating side of a typical utility scale wind farm, that would create $500,000 GDP contribution per year. So this is an annual statistic, and would support, sustain or create 4 to 5 jobs. On the capital side, I do not have the numbers, those intensity numbers in front of me, but on the capital side, during the construction phase of any project, that would typically generate the highest job impacts for a very short duration of time. And once the project kicks into the operation phase, the employment becomes more of a long-term impact, but the numbers are a lot less. Question: why was the emission reduction fund not counted? So at the time when we were doing the analysis, we did not have enough information to include the funding that could potentially be captured through the emission reduction fund. Hence, it was not included in our analysis. Next question here. Where should Canadian stimulus dollars go towards LNG? Any thoughts on the Arctic LNG facilities, Mackenzie Delta, and so on, where we have 12 trillion cubic feet of stranded gas? I mean, potentially, yes. So we could potentially see some of the stimulus money going towards growing of Canadian LNG industry. We didn't go into the sort of such a supply chain detail. We looked at mostly at the upstream and the service sector of the Canadian oil and gas. Whether that money should go into the development of stranded gas in the Mackenzie Delta or other areas in the Northern Hemisphere of Canada. Also a good question, but you know, I probably be the least knowledgeable person when it comes to that. I know they do have one gas that is being used and being where the natural gas is being developed and used domestically. I know there are some programs that are coming from the federal government that look into supporting northern communities, remote communities, with some of the clean tech projects. There's one specific one, I believe, in Ontario, where they're looking at building solar and wind. So there are talks and there are programs that could be addressed and could be potentially looked into and researched more, but we did not do the economic impact assessment of development of the stranded oil and gas resources. Yes, that's true. I guess to the question about the Mackenzie Delta, it is closer to Asian markets. I agree with you. I mean, and we see some of that movement already, some of the conversation when it comes to oil, for example, you know, to expand the market access. There's talks about building the railway to go to Alaska and to ship crude from their terminals. Mackenzie Delta is closer to Asian markets, so it could capture that LNG. The economics, the netbacks for that gas might actually be economic. I haven't looked at those numbers myself, but from what I understand, to develop the Mackenzie Delta, there's other issues that need to be dealt with first before we can just go in and drill for gas and ship it as in the form of LNG. Sorry about that. I'm just going through all these different comments here. Most of them have to do with not being able to hear me this morning. So I apologize again for the little technical blip that we had. But I believe this is it for questions. So just to wrap it up, as I said, stay tuned for part 4. We will be issuing that report sometime mid-November. But the rest of the reports are available to you. So feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions, and if you see something that might spur conversation or discussion, we're more than happy to speak offline. Reach out to us, and we will see you again at the next webinar. The next webinar is scheduled for November 25th, I believe. Don't quote me on that. Check out our website. And that one would look at the oil sands technologies, the innovation in oil sands sector and what impacts could it have on the cost structure and emission profile of various oil sands projects. So thank you very much for attending this morning's webinar. Stay warm, stay healthy, and we will talk to you later. Thank you so much.